They said it would be over in weeks, but here we are 2.5 years later, and the war in Ukraine has done more than just redraw maps. It has crushed lives, leveled cities, and turned the global economy into a battlefield of its own. Ukraine's GDP slashed by over 30% in the first year of war, 7 million people pushed into poverty. One in every three households is now food insecure. Energy prices have soared, inflation has followed, and supply chains they have been slammed from Nigeria to New York. And yet, in all this chaos, there's one acronym that keeps popping up: NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Now, the war didn't start because of NATO, but many would argue it didn't start without it either. Now, let's rewind a bit. April 1949, the Cold War is settling in. The US and 11 European nations sign a treaty to create NATO, a military alliance to counter the growing threat of the Soviet Union. Its mission was simple: keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. And for decades that worked. It was a pact born from the ashes of World War II, built on mutual defense. An attack on one is considered an attack on all. But here's the thing: NATO wasn't supposed to last forever. In fact, after the fall of Soviet Union in 1991, many thought NATO would wind down. But in what can only be described as upsetting for the USSR in 1990s, the NATO state heads issued a statement that said, and I quote, "We recognize that in the new Europe, the security of every state is inseparably linked to the security of its neighbor. NATO must become an institution where Europeans, Canadians, and Americans work together not only for common defense but to build new partnerships with all nations of Europe. The Atlantic community must reach out to the countries of the East, which were our adversaries in the Cold War, and extend them the hand of friendship." Now, it was clear that NATO is going to expand. Between 1999 and 2024, NATO went from 16 to 32 countries. It swallowed up former allies of the Soviets like Poland, Hungary, and Romania, and eventually creeping right up to Russia's doorstep. In 2008, NATO made a big statement: Ukraine and Georgia will become members, and few months later, we all know Russia invaded Georgia. Fast forward to 2014, Russia annexes Crimea, and in 2022, a full scale invasion of Ukraine. Now, let's be clear, none of this justifies Russia's aggression. But many Western diplomats, from George Kennan to Jack Matlock, had warned that expanding NATO eastwards will provoke Moscow. Now, even Biden back in the day expressed hesitation, stating eastward NATO expansion into the Baltic states would cause the greatest consternation, which could tip the balance, and of course result in a vigorous and hostile reaction by Russia. It was all too predictable, but they did it anyways. Now, look, let's talk about the man the West loves to hate, Vladimir Putin. Now, don't mistake this as a defense of his war, but let's ask a simple question: was Putin always this villain, or did they need him to be one? Because here's the uncomfortable truth: he wasn't always like this. In the early 2000s, a younger Putin was actually willing to join NATO. In 2000, he actually floated the idea directly to Bill Clinton, but the door was never truly opened. Instead, year after year, NATO crept east from Poland to the Baltics, right up to Russia's doorstep. Clinton's explanation, and I quote, "My policy was to work for the best while expanding NATO to prepare for the worst," unquote. This was after promises were made, verbal or not, that NATO would not expand 1 inch eastward. From Russia's perspective, this wasn't security, it was encirclement, and they want you to imagine. Imagine this: America's reaction if Mexico joined a Chinese military alliance tomorrow, or if Russian missiles showed up in Cuba again, like they did in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis, over which apparently US nearly went to a nuclear war. So why exactly is it hard to understand Russia's paranoia? As stated earlier in 2008, NATO declared that Ukraine and Georgia would join. That was two red lines crossed for Moscow. And you know how that turned out, of course. You might not agree with his methods, and you shouldn't, but Putin's aggression didn't appear in a vacuum. It grew out of a consistent message from the West: your security doesn't matter. And when you back a former KGB officer against a corner, one who built his entire post-Soviet career on restoring the Russian pride, you do not get diplomacy, you do get war. Now folks, where is NATO now? Well, Sweden and Finland have joined, Ukraine still knocks at the door, and US is more embedded in Eastern Europe than at any point since the Cold War. People who know say that it has become a geopolitical project, a way to cement Western influence under the umbrella of collective security. Critics, including some in the US itself, are getting louder against this very initiative. Donald Trump has said it bluntly. Why should US taxpayers pay for the European security while Europeans themselves enjoy universal healthcare and long vacations? Critics argue Europe has grown too comfortable, too dependent. NATO's bureaucracy makes rapid action hard, and the US, well, it's locked into a treaty where its military might is automatic while Europe hesitates. Folks, even game theory says predictability is weakness. So is NATO still sustainable? Well, today's threats aren't that what they were in 1949. We face climate chaos, AI arms race, cyber warfare, and economic manipulation. But NATO, a Cold War alliance designed to counter tanks rolling through Berlin, still dominates Western military strategy. Meanwhile, Europe's dependence on US defense holds it back from building its own agile, responsive force. And ironically, speaking with NATO, the US may be doing more to enable Europe's military stagnation than deter Russia. Now, then there's the Trump vision in all of this. A world where America says, maybe we'll help, maybe we won't. That uncertainty, it makes adversaries cautious. It keeps everyone guessing. And thus, the real question arises, is NATO protecting peace or preserving an outdated power structure? Because the world has changed, there is no Soviet Union, China, not Russia is the real rival. And Europe, it's rich, resourceful, and more than capable. Some argue it's time for the US to step back to let Europe stand on its own feet, to give the continent the responsibility of defending its own way of life. Now, the war in Ukraine may still rage on, but the history is quietly asking one question. What happens when an alliance built on fear outlives the fear itself, in this case, the Soviet Union and now Russia? And now finally, before we wrap up, here's the random fact of the day for you. NATO member countries represent just 12% of the world population but account for over 55% of global military spending. Now that's cool, but the real test whether that power still has a purpose or just a past. Now, if this gave you something to think about, hit that like button, share around, and tell us in the comments, is NATO still about defense or just dominance? We'll be watching. Stay sharp, stay curious. Until next time, thank you.